Hello there, and welcome to Sleep Science Galaxy, a place where science is no longer loud, and knowledge no longer asks you to make an effort to remember. Right now, you don't need to understand. You don't need to learn. You don't need to do anything at all. You only need to be here. Let your breath slow down, a little deeper, and then grow heavier, as if your body has already been on this earth for millions of years. All the tension of the day can gently release like layers of sediment quietly settling at the bottom of time. Tonight, we will not follow a lecture. We will drift through deep time, a time deeper than any personal memory. Drift along the tree of life, where every being that has ever existed is connected by invisible branches. If your eyelids begin to feel heavier, that is not weakness. It is a sign that you have passed through the first doorway, the doorway that leads into sleep. Evolutionary traces within the human body. When we look at our bodies in the mirror, we usually see a form so familiar that it feels self-evident. 2 arms, 2 legs, a face capable of expressing emotion, a body called human. But if we look more slowly, more deeply, guided by a long breath and a quiet mind, we begin to notice something very different. This body is not a finished design created in a single moment, but an unfinished draft, a living chronicle of hundreds of millions of years of change. Try to imagine a time long before you had a name, before humanity even existed, before memory or language. Other beings lived then, carrying very different forms, inhabiting worlds that would feel utterly foreign to us. Those beings did not disappear completely. Parts of them are still here, quietly, invisibly, within you. Not as fossils, but as tissue, nerves, genes, and reflexes that seem, at first glance, meaningless. From the moment you were only a tiny embryo, when your life had just begun, your body was already telling the story. In the earliest weeks, you had a tail. Not a metaphor, but a real structure, with vertebrae, muscles, and nerves. That tail was not used to wave or to balance, and then it vanished. Not because it was wrong, but because it was no longer needed. Your body absorbed it, like a river slowly retreating after the rainy season, leaving behind a small trace at the end of the spine. The coccyx, so often dismissed as useless, is a whisper from a distant era, when your ancestors depended on a tail to climb, to run, to survive. That story does not stop at shape and form. It reaches deeper into invisible layers beyond our senses. Inside every cell of your body is a genome called human, but it does not stand alone. Your body is a community. Trillions of microorganisms live in your gut, on your skin, in your breath, carrying a number of genes that exceeds human genes themselves. They are not intruders. They are companions. They help digest food, train the immune system, influence mood, and even shape how you perceive the world. When you feel sad, when you feel calm, when you feel anxious, it is not only you who is responding. It is an ancient dialogue between human cells and non-human cells. A relationship refined by evolution across countless generations. You are not a closed individual. You are a thinking ecosystem, a small universe where cooperation matters more than competition. And then there are stranger stories still. Detours hidden within the body. There is a nerve inside you responsible for your voice, for speech itself. Yet instead of traveling directly from the brain to the larynx, it loops downward into the chest, wraps around a large blood vessel, and only then returns upward. This path is illogical, inefficient, and if designed by a modern engineer, it would be judged a mistake. But it is not a mistake. It is a legacy. Long ago, when our ancestors were aquatic creatures, this route was the shortest path. As the neck lengthened, as the heart and lungs shifted position, the nerve was never redrawn. It was stretched, bent, and left to follow its ancient course. The body does not start over. It repairs by layering the new atop the old. And so, every time you speak, a part of you travels a path shaped when fish still swam through the primordial ocean. In the same way, when your skin breaks into goosebumps from cold or emotion, this is not a random reflex. It is the memory of a body once covered in fur. As tiny muscles contract, raising invisible hairs on your skin, they repeat an action that once mattered deeply, retaining warmth or making the body appear larger to frighten an enemy. Today, this reflex is almost meaningless. Yet it was never erased. It remains, like an old melody playing very softly in a quiet room. There is another organ, small and often considered a nuisance, resting silently in your abdomen. It once helped distant ancestors digest tough, cellulose-rich plants. As diets changed, as fire and cooking emerged, that role faded. But the organ did not vanish. It shrank, shifted function, and stayed on as a parenthesis in the evolutionary story. Not everything within you serves a clear purpose today. Some things exist simply because they were never deleted. Even the small muscles behind the ears, allowing some people to twitch their ears slightly when concentrating or startled by sound, are remnants of a time when ears could move independently, like radar, to locate the world. We no longer need that ability. Our world is shaped by vision, by writing, by artificial light. Yet the body remembers. It always remembers. When all these details are seen together, a very different picture emerges. Humans are not the perfect pinnacle of an intelligent plan. Humans are the result of countless revisions, compromises, and accidents. We carry temporary solutions that became permanent, structures preserved not because they were optimal, but because they were good enough to keep living. And that is precisely what makes your body beautiful in a very unusual way. It is not polished. It is not tidy, but it is honest. It is proof that life does not need to be perfect to endure, does not need to erase its past to move forward. It only needs to continue, layer upon layer, generation after generation, slowly, patiently. When you understand this, you can release an invisible burden, the burden of having to be perfect, the burden of having to be right. Your body was never meant to conform to an ideal mold. It was meant to carry history, to adapt, to survive, and to tell the story of life in its own way. And as you lie still, in the gentle darkness, listening to your own breath, remember that each breath does not belong only to you. It is a breath that once moved through gills, through primitive lungs, through the chests of beings who had never known the word human. You are not separate from that current. You are a part of it, continuing to drift very softly, very deeply into sleep. Vestigial organs and structures that were never deleted after listening to the story whispered by the human body, tales that once existed and then dissolved into the spine, lingering reflexes like faint memories. We begin to grow familiar with a gentle yet profound idea. Life never fully erases its own traces, and just as settles, the narrative does not remain within human flesh. It continues outward, flowing into a wider world, where other beings also carry blurred marks of time upon them, like old pages in a book that were never torn away. If you allow your breath to slow by one more beat, imagine the light gradually fading and before you lies a deep cave. No wind, no sunlight, no sense of direction. In that darkness live creatures that have survived for thousands of generations without ever seeing light. Eyes, once windows of survival, become useless, and over time they no longer see. Yet what is strange is this: they never disappear completely. Even in the embryonic stage, these creatures still begin to form eyes. Eye sockets still emerge, the initial structures are still assembled, as if the body has never forgotten how to create sight. The process simply stops. Cells dissolve, tissue is reabsorbed, and darkness quietly reclaims its rule. Here, evolution does not behave like a builder who demolishes the old to construct the new. It is more like a gardener, trimming, softening, allowing what is no longer needed to gently withdraw. In eternal darkness, vision offers no advantage, yet the blueprint of light remains, like a melody that was never fully played. Leaving the cave behind, if we drift with the rhythm of the story into the ocean, we encounter immense beings, creatures whose movements make the water itself tremble. They no longer walk, no longer stand on land, no longer support their weight with legs. And yet, deep within their thick layers of tissue, there remain small, faint bones, resting silently where hips and legs once were meant to be. They do not touch the ground. They do not support the body. They do not aid movement. They simply exist. These bones once played an essential role when the ancestors of these massive marine creatures still wandered along riverbanks, moving slowly through mud. When their world shifted from land to deep water, legs became a burden. But they were not erased from the body as errors. They shrank, diminished, and hid themselves. Like a keepsake stored in a drawer, no longer used, yet never quite thrown away. In the steady breathing of the ocean, we begin to understand something. Life does not forget its origins, even when it has traveled far from its starting point. Then the story turns again, guiding us back to land, where fields were once covered in dense forests, and small creatures fled between tree trunks. There was a time when hoofed animals did not stand on a single toe. They had many toes, spread like hands, suited for soft ground and tangled roots. Each toe was a point of support, allowing the body to move gently through a crowded world. But the world did not stand still. Forests retreated, grasslands opened, space became wide and flat. And in that space, speed became survival. Extra toes became a hindrance. Compact, aligned steps, better suited to bearing force, were gradually favored. Over time, the side toes shrank, faded, and vanished from contact with the ground. Yet, if we look deeper into the skeleton, if we listen to the story the form itself tells, we still find their traces. No longer toes, but small bones. Reminders that today's elegance was built upon yesterday's excess. Here, evolution is not a path toward absolute simplification, but a series of choices that were good enough for specific circumstances. There are no sudden leaps, only things that were once necessary and slowly grew quiet. And if we drift even farther, toward long, supple creatures sliding across grass, stone, and sand, we might believe they never had legs at all. But that is only an illusion of the present. Within their bodies, older blueprints still exist, resting quietly in genetic code. In the early stages of individual life, as the body forms, signs of limbs appear, then are halted, like a road abandoned halfway through, not because it was wrong, but because it no longer needed to continue. In some species, small bones still remain, insufficient for walking, yet enough to prove that another direction once existed. These blueprints were never torn up. They were stored. Evolution has no delete button. It only has archive. When we view these stories together, a shared rhythm emerges. Life is not a continuous march toward an ideal form of perfection. It is more like a river carrying the sediment of every bend it has ever passed. Each layer that settles marks an era. The new layer does not deny the old. It simply rests upon it, compresses it, and softens its edges. We often imagine evolution as a cold hand, ready to discard anything no longer useful. But when we look closely, we see it as far gentler. It preserves. It allows old structures to remain in reduced, silent forms, like stories no longer told aloud, yet never fully gone. And within that gentleness lies a profound lesson for the human mind. We live in a world that constantly demands perfection, urges us to erase the past, to endlessly reinvent ourselves. But life does not do this. It carries the past with it, even the parts that no longer fit. It does not rush to erase. It allows excess. It allows traces. It allows what was once necessary to remain as physical memory. When we understand this, we can look at ourselves differently. Old habits, outdated reflexes, parts of us that feel obsolete. Perhaps they too are simply structures that were never deleted, blueprints that once helped us survive at some point in time. They do not need to be hated. They only need to be recognized and gently set down. And in that quiet state, as the story of life continues to drift slowly onward, we may feel a very subtle comfort. Nothing in nature needs to be perfect. Nothing needs to be entirely new in order to continue existing. Everything has the right to carry its own history. As you close your eyes, letting gentle darkness settle over your thoughts, remember that this world, from the deepest caves to the widest oceans, from the first steps on grass to the silent movement of legless creatures, has been shaped in this way. Not by erasing, but by leaving traces, and little by little, letting them fade. And it is precisely within that fading that sleep arrives, slow, deep, and filled with the memory of time. Convergent evolution. As the old traces slowly fade in the story we have just followed, structures that were never erased, only quietly receding into the background, a very subtle feeling begins to arise. It is the sense that life does not merely carry its own past, but also listens to the world around it, as if the universe were whispering the same hints again and again. And as we relax a little more, letting go of yet another layer of thought, we begin to notice that it is not only memories that are preserved. Successful ideas, too, are reborn, far apart from one another, in forms that appear entirely different. Imagine darkness, not the darkness of sleep, but absolute darkness, where light cannot reach. In such a space, vision becomes meaningless. Yet life does not accept blindness. It listens. High above the ground, in the open night sky, there are creatures that fly through the darkness, thin wings slicing the air, releasing sounds so high-pitched that the human ear cannot hear them. Elsewhere, deep beneath murky water, massive beings glide through the ocean, sending pulses of sound far into the cold depths. Two worlds, two environments, two histories that never touch. And yet both arrive at the same answer to darkness: sound. No one teaches the other. There is no transmission of knowledge. There's only the same pressure and a limited number of effective ways to survive. And the universe, with its infinite patience, allows the same idea to emerge twice, independently, like a melody that proves successful and is quietly tested again. That feeling expands when we turn to more familiar forms. There are creatures that once led humans to believe they were close relatives, simply because of their gait, their snouts, their eyes, and the way they hunt. Yet their histories are separated by hundreds of millions of years. They evolved on different continents, from branches of life that never intersected. And still, when their roles within the ecosystem became similar, fast, pack-hunting predators relying on teeth and speed, their shapes gradually converged, like two sketches drawn in response to the same requirement. Here, form is no longer proof of kinship. It is an answer to a problem. And when the problem is the same, the solution tends to look the same, regardless of who arrives at it. This does not happen only among vertebrates with eyes and teeth and complex behavior. It also unfolds in the quiet world of plants, where time moves more slowly and motion is almost invisible. In arid lands, where water is the rarest resource, certain shapes rise from rock and sand. Thick, water-filled bodies covered in sharp spines. On one continent, they bear one name. On another, a different name. Yet their appearance makes us believe they are the same thing. Only when we look deeper into structure, into flowers, into genes, do we realize that these are distant lineages. Strangers who have coincidentally put on the same suit. Harsh sunlight, dry soil, grazing animals. These conditions do not care about history. They only set demands. And life, no matter where it begins, must answer those demands with similar solutions if it is to persist. Retain water, defend the body, reduce exposed surface. These ideas do not belong to any single evolutionary line. They belong to the environment itself. As the mind drifts even farther, we encounter creatures that live underground, where light is blocked from the very beginning. Their world is vibration, touch, narrow tunnels, and air heavy with the smell of soil. In different parts of the earth, there are creatures that dig in the same way, are blind in the same way, with elongated bodies and powerful forelimbs shaped like biological shovels. At a glance, we might think they are one and the same. But history tells a different story. They come from entirely separate evolutionary branches, carrying genomes with no shared origin. And then we begin to understand that the environment does more than shape behavior. It sculpts form. It whispers to life. If you wish to live here, this shape will help you. And life, no matter where it begins, if it listens long enough, will arrive at the same answer. There is something deeply comforting in this realization. It makes the universe feel less chaotic, not because everything is prearranged, but because there are gentle laws, repeating currents, patterns that emerge when conditions are right. Life does not create within infinite possibility. It creates within the boundaries of physics, chemistry, and environment. And within those boundaries, certain solutions prove especially resilient. This changes how we see diversity. Diversity does not mean disorder. It is more like many different instruments playing variations of an ancient melody. Different tones, different rhythms. But a careful listener can still recognize the underlying theme, repeated, deep, and familiar. And when we apply this feeling to ourselves, a new stillness appears. Perhaps our thoughts, reactions, and ways of facing the world are not entirely unique either. Perhaps they are solutions that have been found many times throughout the history of life. When faced with danger, we withdraw. When resources are scarce, we store. When opportunity appears, we connect. These patterns are not weaknesses. They are solutions that once worked. In the slow breathing of the night, the idea of repetition no longer feels boring. It becomes soothing, like ocean waves repeating endlessly, or stars forming from the same laws, yet still carrying their own beauty. The universe does not need infinite invention to be rich. Given enough space and enough time, good ideas will find their way back. And there, between repetition and difference, we can release the pressure to be unique at all costs. Life never demanded that. It only asks that we fit, that we remain flexible, that we listen. Like creatures in darkness, learning to hear instead of see. Like different forms, learning the same ways to dig, to run, to retain water, to exist. As this thought slowly dissolves, no longer a concept, but a feeling, the mind softens as well. We do not need to strain to be new. We do not need to erase the past or compare ourselves to other paths. In this vast universe, finding a solution that has worked before is not a failure. It is a sign of harmony. And in that moment, when everything seems to gently repeat itself, sleep arrives as a natural continuation. There is no clear ending, only a settling, like the universe deciding to tell an old story once more slowly, more deeply, so that you can drift along without effort. The great transitions of life, as the idea of the universe's recurring solutions gradually settles, after we have grown accustomed to the feeling that life can arrive at the same answers from very distant starting points. Another door opens, more slowly and with greater solemnity. If the previous stories felt like variations on a familiar melody, here that melody begins to change its rhythm. Not through a sudden leap, but through movements so small that almost no one noticed them when they happened. And yet, it was precisely these small movements that changed the entire world. Imagine Earth long ago, when the sky was still unfamiliar with birds, when the land lay open and quiet, and life mostly whispered beneath the surface of water. The ocean was the cradle, the place where every rhythm of survival unfolded. There, creatures with gills and fins drifted with the currents, breathing water and light filtered through waves. There was no intention to leave this world, no plan to conquer land, only individuals seeking a little more food, a little more space, a slightly better chance to survive. And then, in shallow waters, where the boundary between water and air was as thin as a breath, life began to experiment, not through a bold decision, but through a very small curiosity. A fin slightly stiffer than before, an internal structure just strong enough to resist gravity for a brief moment. A single venture onto muddy ground, followed by a return to water. These experiments bore no heroic shape. They were clumsy, slow, and filled with risk. But the universe has always favored those patient enough to try again. Over time, those fins were no longer used only for steering through water. They grew thicker, developed joints, acquired supports. They learned how to brace against the ground, bear weight, and push the body forward. There is no single moment we can point to and say, this is when life stepped onto land. There is only a sequence of sunsets and dawns, of waters receding and returning. And with each cycle, form changed just a little. Within this slow transition, something remarkable happened. Structures once shaped for swimming began to learn how to walk. Movements that once undulated now had to straighten to support the body's own weight. Life, for the first time, felt the pull of Earth in a new way. And Earth, for the first time, felt footsteps. The solemnity of this moment did not come from noise, but from silence. There was no applause, no witnesses, only mud, wind, and creatures unaware that they were opening an entirely new chapter. From those early steps, forests would grow, Insects would take flight, and one day the sky would no longer be empty. Time continued to flow, and life continued to experiment. Land-dwelling creatures did not remain still. Some returned to the water. Some stayed low. Some reached upward. And along another branch of the story, certain beings grew larger and stronger, walking on their hind legs, with forelimbs no longer used primarily to brace against the ground. These limbs became lighter, more flexible, and acquired unusual coverings that helped retain heat or display signals. At first, these coverings had no intention of lifting bodies off the ground. They conserved warmth. They aided communication. They were ornaments of life. But as shapes changed, as muscles and bones adapted, these seemingly secondary structures began to take on a new role. Not through a full deliberate wing beat, but through slightly longer leaps, slightly softer landings. Gravity remained constant, but life learned how to negotiate with it. And then, on a very ancient day that went unrecorded, there was a creature that did not fall immediately. It glided, if only for a brief moment. But that moment was enough for the universe to remember, enough for life to realize that the sky was not a wall, but a space open to negotiation. Those creatures did not know that their descendants would one day fill the air with song, that the sky would become a complex ecosystem. They only knew that their bodies felt lighter, faster, and that they had gained another path of escape. Yet within that unawareness, one of the greatest transitions had occurred. The ground was no longer the final boundary. Across all these stories, one gentle detail repeats itself. Life does not create the new from nothing. It does not discard what exists in order to rebuild from scratch. It repairs. It extends. It folds. Structures once used to push against water became tools to brace against land, and gradually became arms, hands. Small bones aligned in sequence, delicate joints formed, allowing movement to become more precise, more flexible. A hand did not appear as a complete idea. It is the result of millions of years of adjustment, where every small change carried a cost paid in survival. And yet, from this slow process emerged the ability to grasp, to manipulate, to shape the world, not only to build tools, but to touch, to feel, to connect. When we look at our hands, we rarely think of the ocean. But within the structure of the bones, in the way the fingers curve, in how force is distributed, the memory of water still remains. The fin never vanished. It simply learned how to become something else. And in that transformation, there was no betrayal of the past, only continuity. These great transitions did not unfold to the sound of triumphant horns. They took place in silence, in mud, in wind, in afternoons no one witnessed. They had no final destination. No creature knew it was moving toward a higher form. There was only environmental pressure and adaptation that was just sufficient. That is why the epic quality here is not loud or grand. It is like gazing at a mountain range in early mist. No obvious movement, yet carrying within it millions of years of uplift and erosion. Each transition in life is a layer of rock resting atop the last, silent but enduring. As these stories settle into the mind, we begin to feel a rhythm that is very slow, very deep. A rhythm of time measured not by clocks, but by changes in form. It reminds us that the greatest transformations rarely happen in dramatic moments. They happen when we are not paying attention, when everything seems still. And within that rhythm lies a quiet comfort. If life could move from water to land, from land to sky, through nothing more than small adjustments and infinite patience, then perhaps changes within ourselves do not need to be rushed either. Perhaps stepping into a new phase does not require erasing who we were, but simply a new perspective, a different point of support, a new way of distributing weight. As night falls and consciousness begins to soften, the great transitions of life are no longer facts to remember. They become a current to drift within. You do not need to understand everything. You only need to feel that you are standing, breathing, using structures that once swam, once stepped, once flew in the imagination of life. And within that solemn, unhurried feeling, sleep arrives. Not as an interruption, but as another transition. Gentle, natural, with no need to know the destination. Strange and exceptional creatures, as the great transitions of life settle into solemn silence, as the idea of moving from water to land, from ground to sky, still lingers softly like the fading echo of an ancient epic. The flow of the story suddenly shifts its rhythm. No longer are we following movements that reshape the entire world, but unexpected turns, private paths, where life seems to whisper, "I do not need to resemble anyone at all." And it is precisely along these paths that strange creatures appear, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, existing like gentle question marks placed within the universe. Imagine a very calm morning, when the light has not yet grown harsh. In a still stream, a creature swims slowly, covered in soft fur, with a beak like a bird's, webbed feet, and a body that confuses every definition. It lays eggs, yet feeds its young with milk. It senses the world not only through sight or sound, but through faint electrical signals in the water. As if life had gathered many different ideas and softly stitched them together, not to create perfection, but to see what might happen if boundaries were gently blurred. This creature is in no hurry to prove anything. It does not represent a trend, nor is it anyone's next step. It is simply a small branch growing off at an angle from the main trunk, yet still receiving enough light to survive. And in that divergence, we feel a rare kind of freedom. Life is not required to be simple, nor obligated to meet the expectations of the observer. Then the story leads us underground, where light never reaches. There, in narrow tunnels and dense air, live creatures in tightly knit communities. Hairless, wrinkled-skinned, with body temperatures less stable than those of other mammals. Their bodies seem indifferent to beauty as we commonly define it. They care about efficiency, endurance, and survival in a world where oxygen is scarce and darkness is the default state. What makes us pause is not their appearance, but the way they experience pain, or more precisely, how they almost do not experience certain familiar kinds of pain at all. In their environment, such signals would only be useless noise. And so, over long spans of time, life chose to lower the volume of pain, not out of bravery, but out of necessity. There is a strange gentleness in that choice, as if evolution, in a rare moment, decided that not every sensation needs to be preserved, that sometimes, to live more peacefully, one must learn not to react to every stimulus. If we drift onward, leaving the underground to return to water, the story bends again. Here, life does not merely sense the world, it sends signals into it. There are creatures capable of generating electricity, not to produce light, but to communicate, to navigate, to hunt. Their bodies transform cells once used for contraction into tiny biological batteries, aligned and synchronized, producing electrical pulses that are subtle or powerful. In the darkness of deep rivers, electricity becomes a language. No images, No colors, only vibrations spreading through water. And we begin to realize that senses are not a fixed list. They are abilities that can be restructured if the environment demands it. This feeling deepens further when we encounter beings whose intelligence does not lie in bodily form, but in how information is used. There are soft-bodied marine creatures without bones or shells, yet possessing biological strategies that cause scientists to pause and reconsider. Rather than treating the genome as a rigid instruction manual, they treat it like a piece of music open to improvisation. Genetic information is not only read, but edited during life itself, allowing the body to respond flexibly to temperature, light, and circumstance. Here, life does not wait for the next generation to change. It adjusts in the present, not urgently, not in panic. Just a soft adaptation, like water changing shape when it meets an obstacle. And then, in another corner of the aquatic world, there are creatures that make the concept of impossible feel fragile. When oxygen runs out, when most vertebrates would quickly fall into permanent silence, they choose a different path. They switch fuels, slow their rhythms, enter a state close to deep sleep, where time is no longer measured by heartbeat, but by the ability to wait. There is no drama, no struggle for breath, only quiet adaptation, as if life were whispering. We can wait. And in that waiting, the boundary between activity and rest begins to blur. What is remarkable about all these creatures is not that they are strange. Strangeness is only our perspective, shaped by familiarity with common patterns. From the inside, from the viewpoint of life itself, they are simply different answers to very specific questions. How do you survive in darkness? How do you communicate without light? How do you conserve energy when resources are scarce? How do you remain flexible in a world that is always changing? And so these creatures do not shock us. They gently surprise us, a surprise that does not fully awaken us, but simply causes the mind to lift an eyebrow and smile. Like hearing an unexpected note in a familiar harmony. It does not break the melody, it deepens it. In the relaxed state of night, these stories do not ask us to analyze or remember. They only invite us to feel the breadth of what life can be. That there is no single path, no standard form, no immutable rulebook. Life allows exceptions to exist, not at the margins, but as an essential part of the whole. And within that feeling, we can let go of a very human worry. The worry of needing to be normal, to be correct, to resemble the majority. The universe has never demanded that. It only asks for fit to circumstance, and it is willing to allow very different paths to exist side by side. As this thought settles, the mind softens. Surprise no longer sharpens awareness. Instead, it reassures us. Reassures us that the world is wider than any definition. That difference is not error, but experiment. That we do not need to understand everything in order to rest. And so, among these strange yet quiet creatures, among survival strategies that seem to belong to no familiar world, sleep arrives very gently, not as an interruption, but as a permission. Permission for the mind to drift, just as life itself has drifted through countless forms, slowly, patiently, and with deep compassion. Evolved behavior and intelligence. As the strange creatures of the previous chapter quietly close their stories, as the mind grows accustomed to the idea that life can choose very different paths and still exist in calm balance, another thin layer of the world begins to reveal itself. No longer about shape, no longer about bodily structure or unusual survival strategies. This time, what gently rises to the surface is something far more invisible. the way life senses, remembers, learns, and responds to the world around it. And it is here, within this hazy zone between instinct and awareness, that a very old misunderstanding begins to dissolve. We often imagine intelligence as a tall mountain, with humans standing at the peak, looking down upon the rest of life. But when we slow our gaze, when we stop searching for familiar markers like language or complex tools, we begin to see that intelligence is not a mountain at all, but a network. It spreads in many directions, appears in places we least expect, and takes forms that do not need to resemble us in order to be profound. Imagine a very early morning when the city is still asleep. On a high tree branch, a dark feathered creature watches the world below. Its gaze is not unconscious. It evaluates. It remembers. It anticipates. Inside that small brain, relationships of cause and effect are arranged like pieces of a puzzle. If this object is placed here, that outcome will follow. If it waits a little longer, the opportunity will change. No words, no diagrams. Yet there is planning, there is flexibility, there is an understanding that the world is not static, and that today's actions can shape tomorrow. Here, intelligence is quiet. It does not demand recognition. It is simply the ability to see beyond the present moment. And when we recognize this, a layer of very human pride begins to fall away. Perhaps complex thought is not a privilege. Perhaps it is simply a survival strategy, one that emerges wherever pressure is sufficient and time is long enough. And when we turn closer, back into the familiar space of human life, we find a bond woven through thousands of years of shared existence. A glance, a subtle shift in tone, a gesture almost unconscious, and it is understood, not through slow reasoning, but through sensitivity refined across countless generations. This sensitivity is not magic. It is the result of living together, observing together, depending on one another. In this relationship, intelligence does not appear as the ability to solve abstract problems, but as the capacity to read emotion, to sense when to move closer, when to step back, to know when joy is spreading, when sorrow needs to be respected. It is a form of understanding that is delicate, deeply social, and remarkably effective. No shared language is required, yet dialogue exists. And we begin to understand that intelligence is not only the ability to manipulate the physical world, it is also the ability to adjust one's own behavior in response to the inner states of others, a form of empathy that does not need a name. Farther away, in forests where sound matters more than sight, intelligence rises through song, not as a complete, inborn melody, but as a process of learning, listening, imitating, practicing, failing, correcting. There are young individuals who, if raised in silence, will never sing properly, not because they lack vocal organs, but because they lack social experience. Here, intelligence takes the shape of culture, something transmitted not by genes, but by sound. One generation influences the next, not only through bodily structure, but through patterns of behavior. There are dialects, variations, local histories, and there is collective memory, stored not in DNA, but in echoes passed through time. When we recognize this, we are compelled to expand our definition of intelligence once more. It is not only individual. It can exist between individuals, within networks of interaction, within the repetition and continual adjustment of behavior, and then, in a very different corner of the familiar world, there are creatures we once considered simple, even trivial. Yet when placed in subtle situations, when asked to respond to the image of their own bodies, something unexpected happens. There is hesitation. There is recognition. There is action directed not outward, but inward. That moment is very small. There is no complex emotional display, no extended reflection. But it is enough to raise a profound question. Where does self-awareness begin? Does it require a large brain, or only a certain degree of connection between sensation and action? Perhaps self-recognition is not a door that suddenly swings open, but a blurred transitional zone. And within that zone, many species may enter, each in its own way, to varying degrees. When we weave all these stories together, a very different picture emerges. Intelligence is no longer a linear ladder. It is more like a spectrum of light. At each point, it serves a different need. In each form, it expresses itself in the way best suited to that species' environment, bodily structure, and evolutionary history. No form of intelligence is lower simply because it does not resemble ours. It is merely answering a different task, a different context, a different question that life is trying to solve. And in this realization, there is a deep softening. We no longer need to carry the burden of standing apart from the rest of the living world. We no longer need to defend a fragile boundary between us and them. Instead, we can feel ourselves as part of a vast network of intelligence, one in which thinking, feeling, and learning emerged long before humans gave them names. This does not make humanity smaller. It makes the world larger. And in that larger world, intelligence is no longer a pressure to prove, to surpass, to dominate. It becomes a natural quality of life, arising wherever there is a need to understand and adapt. As the night deepens, as thoughts slow, this idea no longer needs further analysis. It only needs to be felt, that you are not alone in your capacity to think and feel, that the ways you learn, bond, and respond to the world are part of a very ancient tradition, shared far more widely than you may have imagined. And within that sense of connection, there is a very gentle reassurance. Not because you understand everything, but because you do not need to understand everything in order to belong. Intelligence does not demand dominance. It only requires presence. As this thought gradually dissolves, no longer a concept, but a warm sensation spreading through the chest, sleep arrives naturally. As if the mind, having realized it is not the sole center of the world, can finally rest. Reproduction and unusual life strategies. As the idea of intelligence spreading throughout the living world gently settles, once we have grown accustomed to the feeling that thinking, sensing, and learning are not the exclusive domain of humans, a deeper layer of the story of life begins to unfold. This time, it does not speak about how life understands the world, but about how life continues itself. Not through familiar patterns, not through rules we often consider natural, but through paths that soften every definition, as if the universe were whispering, there is no single way to exist. We grow up with very clear stories about roles, about sequences, about how one generation follows the next. These stories give us a sense of stability. Yet deep in the ocean, among seagrass swaying with the currents, there are beings that do not follow that order. There, life has reversed roles that seem fixed. A body that appears slender, gentle, uncompetitive, becomes the place where new life is nurtured and protected. Not because of a declaration, not to stand out, but simply because, in that world, this way works better. Life does not concern itself with who should do what. It cares only about what gives the next generation a higher chance of continuing. And when the environment shifts, roles shift with it. Softly, like water changing course. There is no rupture, only adjustment. Farther still, in dry and isolated lands where finding a mate is a profound challenge, life has chosen a very different path. No waiting, no dependence, no need for the union of two different individuals. A single body can continue its own line. New generations emerge almost as replicas of the previous one, carrying absolute stability into a world full of uncertainty. Here, diversity does not arise from combination, but from endurance. This is not a less evolved choice, as we sometimes hastily label it. It is a strategy suited to circumstance, where safety lies in not having to wait for a rare condition to occur. As we observe these stories, a subtle shift begins to take place in the mind. What we once believed to be immutable laws turn out to be habits of perception. Life has never signed a permanent contract with any single model. It is more flexible, more pragmatic, and far less concerned with norms than we often imagine. In the deepest parts of the ocean, where distances between individuals are vast and encounters are as rare as shooting stars, life goes even further. There, simply finding one another is a miracle. And to ensure that this miracle is not lost, life chooses complete union, not through promises, not through ritual, but through the body itself. Two individuals become one. Separation becomes unnecessary. Distance, the greatest enemy of that environment, is entirely removed. From a human perspective, this can feel confusing, even uncomfortable. But when viewed through the slow breath of evolution, a very pure logic emerges. When the environment does not allow for a second chance, life learns to make the first chance last forever. Then, along another branch of the story, life decides to skip intermediate stages altogether. No temporary forms, no complex transformations. The new generation enters the world in an almost complete form, avoiding the risks of a fragile transitional phase. In environments where water is not always safe, shortening the journey becomes a powerful advantage. Here, we see clearly that evolution does not favor elaborate rituals. It favors paths with the least risk. If a stage can be removed while still ensuring continuity, it will fade and then disappear, like a bridge no longer needed once a new road has been built. As all these stories drift through the mind, not as facts, but as hazy images in a dream, a very gentle effect begins to take place. The standards we carry about roles, sequences, about right and wrong, gradually lose their rigidity. They do not collapse. They simply soften. And when things soften, we no longer need to hold them so tightly. Perhaps this is the greatest gift of these stories about reproduction and unusual life strategies. They do not challenge us through argument. They simply whisper that the world is wider than the frameworks we are used to, that control is not always the best way to survive, and that sometimes letting go of roles, of expectations, even of the need to understand, is the path that requires the least energy. In this state, the mind begins to breathe differently, no longer trying to place everything in the correct order, no longer needing to label or judge. Everything is allowed to simply be itself. Those creatures do not need our approval to exist, and we do not need our own perfection in order to rest. There is a very deep comfort in realizing that life does not insist on norms. It does not demand balance according to a single template. It only observes the environment, experiments, and keeps what works. There is no absolute morality, no sacred order, only continuation. And when we understand this, we can apply it very gently to ourselves. Perhaps we do not need to live according to every pattern we were taught. Perhaps the transitional stages of our lives do not need to look the same. Perhaps skipping a few standard steps is not failure, but adaptation. Perhaps relying on others or moving forward alone are simply different strategies for different circumstances. As these thoughts are no longer tightly held, but hover like mist, a familiar sensation begins to arise. The body grows heavier. The breath lengthens. The mind stops trying to control the flow of the story. It allows the story to pass through, like water flowing over stone. And in that very moment of release, sleep becomes easier. Not because you have understood all of life's strategies, but because you have allowed yourself not to need to understand them all. Just as life has done for hundreds of millions of years, try, keep what works, and then continue, very gently, very slowly, and very quietly. Color, light, and sensation. As the patterns of life's continuity soften, as roles and sequences loosen their grip on the mind, a very natural pause emerges. In that pause, life is no longer felt as a series of strategies or adaptations, but as a subtle sensory experience. The question is no longer, how does one survive, but simply, what does this world feel like? And it is here that the story slows once more, as if time itself were lowering its voice to match the light. Let your mind drift into a distant dawn, where the first light touching earth carries more than the colors you know. There are beings who see bands of light the human eye will never reach. In their world, the sky is not only blue or gray. Flowers are not only yellow or red. On petals, on feathers, on bark, there are brilliant patterns we pass by every day without ever knowing they are there. That world exists alongside ours, without overlap, without competition, different only in how light is received. There, light is not only for seeing, it is for communicating, for recognizing, for choosing. Signals invisible to us are clear whispers to others. And suddenly we realize that reality is not a single image. It is many transparent layers laid atop one another, each species living within its own version of the same space. As this thought gently spreads, the narrative carries us away from the sky and down into deep water. Where sunlight disappears after only a few dozen meters, darkness is not an absence, but a baseline condition. In that darkness, some creatures do not wait for light to arrive. They create their own. Not a brilliant glow to illuminate the world, but soft, rhythmic points of light, just enough to mark presence. These points of light are not overwhelming. They are like distant stars, shimmering in the vast blackness of the ocean. Light becomes language, lure, greeting, boundary. In a world without clear day or night, this self-made light creates rhythm, allowing life to orient itself within immensity. There is something deeply meditative in this image. No need for great brightness, no need to illuminate everything, only enough to exist, enough to be seen, enough not to lose one another in the dark. And if we hover between two worlds, where light is strong enough to penetrate water but still scattered and bent, we see luminous structures used in a different way, not to shine in the night, but to protect against the harshness of daylight. In coral reefs, color is not decoration. It is a filtering layer, transforming intense sunlight into gentler, safer bands for the fragile symbiotic life within. Those glowing blues, reds, and greens do not exist to impress human eyes. They are the result of a long dialogue between light and life, a quiet negotiation in which light is redirected and softened so that photosynthesis can continue without harm. Here, color is care. It is protection. It is a form of wordless intelligence. This feeling grows even more dreamlike when we think of creatures that nearly disappear within the very light of their environment. There are delicate wings without strong color, without the kind of reflection we expect. Instead, they allow light to pass through, not hiding in shadow, not displaying brilliance, but dissolving. In motion, they become part of the air, part of the background, difficult to grasp, difficult to define. Here, existence does not come from standing out, but from blending in, not from attracting attention, but from letting attention slip past. It is a survival strategy very different from how humans often think about presence. And in seeing it, we may feel a gentle lesson. Sometimes safety lies in not needing to be clearly seen. All these stories, drifting through the mind in the slow rhythm of night, are no longer scientific examples to analyze. They become soft images, almost dreamlike. Light is no longer a sharp edge dividing day from night. It becomes a flexible substance, able to bend, to emit, to absorb, to give itself away, according to the needs of life. And within this flow, our own sense of perception begins to shift. We realize that what we see is not the whole. What we do not see is not emptiness. The world continues, rich and subtle, even when our senses close. This brings a deep comfort to the state of preparing for sleep. We do not need to monitor everything. We do not need to perceive every color. We do not need to keep our eyes open for the world to continue existing. Life has long learned to operate in darkness, in dim light, in invisible spectra. And so we too can allow ourselves to release our gaze. As eyelids grow heavy and outer light fades, another world still glimmers in deeper layers, where our attention is not required. Luminous creatures continue to pulse. Fluorescent structures quietly transform tomorrow's sunlight. Transparent wings pass through the air without leaving a trace. The world does not need us awake to function. It learned how to illuminate itself, regulate itself, and sense itself long before humans appeared. And when we remember this, a familiar burden is set down, the burden of needing to observe, to control, to understand. With slower, deeper breaths, the light within the mind softens as well. No longer sharp, no longer high in contrast. Everything blends together like watercolor spreading across paper. And in that haze, sleep does not arrive like an abrupt switch turned off, but like a long sunset, where light gradually dissolves into darkness, leaving behind the quiet reassurance that even when we no longer see, the world is still there, gentle, silent, and full of unseen color. Evolution is still happening. As the final light of the previous chapter fades like a very slow sunset, as the world of colors and invisible spectra softens behind gently closing eyelids, another idea begins to rise. Quiet, yet steady. It is the feeling that everything we have just listened to does not belong solely to the past. Life is not a silent museum. It is still in motion, right now, within you. We often speak of evolution as if it were something already completed, like a thick book resting on a shelf, its chapters written long ago. But if we listen more closely, if we keep our breath slow and let the mind open just a little, another truth reveals itself. That book is still being written. The ink has not dried. And whether we realize it or not, we remain part of that unfinished draft. In spaces far too small for the naked eye to see, life is learning how to face new challenges. Simple organisms, seemingly fragile, respond faster than any others. They try, they fail, they adapt. Within only a few short generations, they change the way they exist, not through intention, but through probability. There is no plan, yet there are results. And those results spread outward, forcing humans to confront an uncomfortable reality. Evolution does not stop simply because we wish for stability. Here, evolution is no longer an ancient tale told through fossils and sedimentary rock. It becomes a more urgent, more intimate pulse, reminding us that life is always responding to what we do. Every choice, every intervention creates pressure, and wherever there is pressure, there is change. But this is not limited to the microscopic world. On Earth's surface, under the familiar sun, the human body has also been continuing its story. When our ancestors moved away from sun-rich regions, when they entered places with grayer skies and longer winters, light became a decisive factor. The body listened to light. It adjusted. It altered its tone, not to become more beautiful, but to balance protection and absorption. There is no standard skin color. There are only different responses to the same source of energy. These changes do not happen within a single lifetime. They are slow, very slow, yet they are continuous. And they remind us that the form we carry today is not an endpoint. It is a temporary version, suited to certain conditions at a particular moment in Earth's history. The story continues as humans change how they eat, how they live, how they relate to their environment. What was once a rare exception gradually becomes common. Some bodies learn to process new sources of nourishment, not by personal choice, but through shared circumstance. Small genetic changes, when placed within cultural and environmental contexts, suddenly matter. They do not make humans better in a moral sense. They simply make humans more compatible with the ways of living they themselves have created. Here, the boundary between biology and culture begins to blur. We do not evolve only because of nature. We evolve because of ourselves. Every habit, every technology, every shift in lifestyle becomes a new selective pressure. And life, as always, does not object. It adjusts. Even the brain, often regarded as our greatest achievement, is not a fixed structure. It has expanded, reorganized, and refined itself over a relatively short span compared to the full history of life. Regions involved in communication, cooperation, imagination, and planning have become more prominent. But the cost is also real. Higher energy demand, greater fragility, increased susceptibility to overload. No gift arrives without its price. And importantly, this process is not finished. There is no sign that the brain has reached a final form. The world continues to change. Pressures continue to arise. And the brain, like every other part of the body, will continue to respond, perhaps in ways we cannot yet predict. When we view all of this together, a message emerges, clear, yet not unsettling. We are not complete, but this is not a flaw. It is the nature of life. There is no final version, no perfect state at which to stop, only temporary states good enough to continue. In human life, we often grow tired of the feeling of not being enough, not skilled enough, not stable enough, not finished enough. But when placed within the long current of evolution, that feeling suddenly feels natural. Life has never aimed for static perfection. It has aimed for adaptability. And adaptability is always an open process. Recognizing this can bring a deep sense of relief. We do not need to become a finished version of ourselves. We only need to be a version that is responding to the present world, just as our bodies are doing, cell by cell, adjustment by adjustment. As the night deepens, as the mind stops searching for clear conclusions, the idea of an unfinished self no longer feels frightening. It becomes gentle, like a reminder that we are still on a journey, and that the journey does not need to be rushed. The world is still changing. Life is still experimenting. And you, in this moment, do not need to keep up with everything. You only need to breathe. Only need to allow yourself to be part of this unfinished flow. When this thought settles, not as a scientific concept, but as a soothing sensation, the body relaxes further. There's nowhere to reach, nothing to complete. In this vast universe, the act of becoming has always been enough. And within that sense of enoughness, sleep arrives very softly, like a chapter pausing, not an ending, but simply a rest before the story continues to be written. Humans as a composite. As the idea that life is still unfolding gently closes, like a long, slow breath. When the feeling of being unfinished no longer causes unease, but instead becomes an invitation to rest, the story naturally drifts into a wider space. No longer about changes happening out there, but about a truth very close at hand. Human beings themselves, in this seemingly familiar form, are also a flowing composite. Not a single, unified block, not a solitary design, but a chord formed from many ancient melodies, layered over stretches of time so vast that memory can no longer reach them. If you look closely at your own body, not with judgment, but with gentle curiosity, you will see the seams. They are not sealed shut. They appear like layers of sediment, each one a trace of a different era. No layer has ever been completely erased. New layers simply rest atop old ones, preserving whatever remained useful enough to continue. Even at the deepest level, where we often imagine things to be the most pure, the story is far from simple. Within the human genetic code are segments that do not belong to humanity in the usual sense. They are traces of very ancient encounters between our ancestral cells and tiny entities that once invaded them. Instead of being completely removed, parts of them stayed. They fell silent. They were deactivated. Yet they remain there, like faint lines in an old manuscript. What is remarkable is this. Some of these traces do not exist merely as memories of conflict, but have become tools. They were repurposed, modified, and incorporated into essential bodily functions. As if life does not draw a strict boundary between us and not us. It cares only about what can be used. And if something can be used, it is kept, regardless of origin. When this thought settles, it brings with it a deep sense of humility. We are not entirely ourselves in an isolated sense. We are places where many histories intersect, cooperate, and compromise. That feeling spreads further when we observe our most familiar movements. A hand lifts, fingers flex and extend, grasp, touch the world. We rarely think about the origin of such motion. Yet within the bone structure, in the way joints connect, in the orderly sequence of small segments, the memory of water still remains. Movements once created to paddle, to push a body through a fluid environment, were gradually adjusted to function in air, to resist gravity, to manipulate solid objects. There was never a moment when one structure vanished and a new one appeared from nothing. Only a long transition. Old forms were retained, reassigned, and taught to operate under new conditions. And so, each time you hold someone's hand, each time you place your hand on your chest to feel your breath, you are using tools that once belonged to an entirely different world. That breath carries a similar story. Air flows in, spreads through countless tiny chambers, exchanges, and then flows out. The mechanism seems so obvious that we forget it did not always exist. There was a time when life did not breathe this way. A time when gas served other roles, stored, regulated, used for different purposes. And then, as environments changed, structures that once helped bodies float, adjust pressure, or reduce weight were reconfigured into sites of exchange for life itself. Human breathing today is not a new invention. It is the continuation of an old function placed into a new context. And so, every time you take a deep breath, it is not only oxygen entering your blood. A long history is being activated, repeated, sustained. Perhaps the most striking composite, however, lies where we most strongly anchor our identity, the mind. The human brain, with its capacity for abstract thought, imagination, storytelling, and self-observation, is often placed on a pedestal. Yet seen through an evolutionary lens, it is simply a structure that expanded very rapidly over a very short span of time. An acceleration, a bold experiment. The brain did not appear as a complete whole. It expanded section by section, reorganized pathway by pathway, using older foundations to build new capabilities. Regions that once processed movement, sensation, and sound became connected in increasingly complex ways, allowing language, long-term memory, and self-awareness to emerge. But the foundation remains. There is no absolute separation between a human brain and an animal brain. Only differences in degrees of connection and speed of processing. This softens our sense of self. The thoughts you are having now, the emotions passing through you, are not separate from the rest of life. They are continuations. New branches growing from a very ancient trunk. When we see humans as a composite, as a synthesis of many eras, many environments, many experiments, a particular emotion begins to form. Not loud pride, but quiet humility. We do not stand outside the current to observe it. We are within it. We carry it in every cell. This feeling does not make humans smaller. It makes us less alone. We are not strangers in an alien universe. We are a part of a long process in which matter learned how to live. Life learned how to feel. And feeling learned how to look back at itself. As this idea spreads, a sense of connection becomes very clear. There are no rigid boundaries between natural and artificial, between human and the rest. Only different levels of organization, complexity, and awareness. Everything is related. Everything is assembled. In this state, the mind no longer wants to claim the center. It begins to dissolve, like a drop of water realizing it belongs to the ocean, not disappearing, simply expanding. And it is this very dissolution that brings a deep quiet. No need to defend identity with sharp borders. No need to prove uniqueness, because uniqueness, if it exists at all, lies in participating in a story so vast that it requires no single protagonist. As you lie there, letting the body rest and thoughts slow, remember this. You are not a finished object in need of fixing. You are a composite functioning remarkably well, a combination of ancient water, air, light, microorganisms, memory, and stories retold across millions of years. There is no pressure to become correct, no demand to reach a final form, only continuation, very gentle, very patient. And in that humility, as you no longer stand apart but dissolve into the wider flow of life, sleep ceases to be a retreat. It becomes a form of integration, a way for body and mind to hand control back to ancient processes that learned how to operate long before you ever needed to think about them. In the quiet night, the composite continues to function. Blood flows, cells repair themselves, the brain reorganizes memory. You do not need to do anything at all. The current of life already knows how to carry you. And now, You only need to allow yourself to drift. The lullaby conclusion. As the feeling of dissolving into the current of life becomes deep enough, as the idea of the human being as a composite is no longer a thought, but a gentle acceptance, the story no longer needs to go any further. There is no peak to reach, no conclusion to seal, only a natural circle closing very slowly, like the final breath of a long day. And in that moment, sleep is not summoned, it is allowed. Let the images that have just passed settle like fine sand in water. There is no need to hold on to them, no need to remember. What needs to remain will remain in its own way. What is unnecessary will dissolve, like echoes fading in a wide valley. The steady rhythm continues, without leading, without urging, simply reminding the body that time is still moving along a very familiar path. Everything continues, not in the loud manner of daytime, but in the quiet rhythm of night. Somewhere, cells are still dividing. Somewhere, water is still flowing. Somewhere, light is still being created in the deepest darkness of the ocean. There is no absolute stopping point, only pauses. And sleep is such a pause. Not a disappearance, but a softer form of continuation. When you close your eyes, the world does not shut down. It simply changes how it operates. Ancient processes, those that have been at work long before you ever needed to think about them, quietly take over. Let your breath return to its natural rhythm. No need for it to be deeper. No need for it to be slower. Just let it be real. Each inhale is a receiving. Each exhale is a letting go. There is no goal ahead, nothing to achieve, only a gentle repetition, like waves touching the shore and pulling back again and again. Words, too, begin to return to themselves. No new stories are told, no new doors are opened. They only repeat a familiar feeling that everything continues, even when you are no longer paying attention, that life does not require your constant awareness in order to function, that you are allowed to step away from the role of observer. There is a deep sense of safety in this idea. Safety does not come from control, but from trust. Trust that the earth continues to turn. Trust that your body knows how to rest. Trust that the mind, when not forced to think, will reorganize itself according to very ancient patterns. And so, there is no call to action here, no request to do anything more, no reminder to remember or to return, only a gentle presence, enough that you do not feel abandoned in the silence. Like a dim light at the end of a hallway, not illuminating the path, but letting you know that you are not alone. The music continues to repeat, unchanged, without crescendo. It is like the rotation of planets, steady, unhurried. Within that rhythm, time is no longer felt in minutes or seconds. It becomes a wide current, where moments dissolve into one another. Everything continues, but you do not need to accompany it in a waking state. You have traveled far enough for today. Attention may rest, curiosity may fold itself away. Questions do not need answers right now. The universe is not in a hurry, and neither are you. Let the feeling of heaviness spread gently through the body, as if the earth itself were supporting you, not pulling you downward, but holding you from below, stable, solid, secure. Any remaining tension can be set down, like something you no longer need to carry into sleep. In this quiet space, there are no sharp boundaries between you and the surrounding world. Near and distant sounds blend together. Thoughts come and go without needing to linger. Everything becomes rounded, without edges, without demands. And when the circle closes, it does not lock. It opens in another way, not opening toward new knowledge, but toward deep rest. Sleep is not an ending. It is another form of continuation, where body and mind work without requiring your participation. Everything continues. Tomorrow will arrive, whether you are watching or not. But right now, in this very quiet moment, you do not need to be there. You only need to be here, in the breath, in the repeating rhythm, in the safety of having nothing to do at all. And if awareness begins to fade, if words dissolve before they can finish, that is not a loss. It is a sign that the circle has completed its task. The door has opened. Sleep well. The story will continue, even while you dream.